It was 5:52 in the morning on the Nysa Verge agricultural belt. The sky did not dawn. It burned. A sick, searing silver replaced the familiar violet twilight. It looked like a scalpel dragging across the throat of the atmosphere. The clouds peeled back. The stars vanished. The void itself was being ripped open. Aboard the logistics escort ship Rookfall, Tamsin Vale gripped the edge of the command console. Her knuckles turned white. She was 29 years old, a human officer built for practicality over polish. She knew the difference between a solar flare and a nightmare. The sensor arrays howled in a chaotic chorus. Thermal metrics spiked off the charts. Gravimetric readings inverted. This was no natural phenomenon. Space-time was being violently pried apart from the outside. Something was forcing its way in. Then came the noise. A distress signal hit the receivers. It was archaic, raw, and unencrypted. It crashed through the tactical firewalls and bled into every available frequency. Public broadcasting, military channels, automated shipping lanes, all of them drowned in a digitized scream. Tamsin tracked the origin. It came from a decaying orbital storage relay, a piece of junk floating on the absolute edge of the colony's gravitational anchor. 2 minutes later, the colonial defense grid died. It was not a gradual failure. It was absolute. The orbital cannons powered down. The shield generators went dark. The planetary communication nodes fell silent. A synchronized, terrifying blackout of humanity's entire military infrastructure on the verge. "Captain is unresponsive," the comms officer shouted, panic lacing his voice. "Colonial command is dark. We are blind." Tamsin did not hesitate. The rulebook dictated holding position. The rulebook was currently floating in a dead system. She was always better at improvising than following doctrine. "Reroute all auxiliary power to the thrusters," Tamsin ordered, her voice cutting through the rising panic on the bridge. "Helm, bring us to that relay. Full burn." The Rookfall groaned as it accelerated. It was a heavy, ugly ship, designed for hauling grain and parts, not for rapid tactical maneuvers. But it moved. They reached the derelict relay just as its structural integrity began to fail. Tamsin threw on an environmental suit and bypassed the automated airlock protocols. She breached the decaying station herself. Zero gravity, frost clinging to the bulkheads, floating debris. She found the source of the signal tethered to a collapsing power conduit. It was not human. Tamsin dragged the limp, ash-gray figure into the Rookfall's airlock. The creature was shockingly frail, its limbs brittle, its chest covered in deep, scorched lacerations. As the airlock pressurized and artificial gravity took hold, the alien convulsed. Its blood was thick and iridescent. Tamsin knelt beside it, tearing off her helmet. The alien's eyes snapped open. They were entirely black, devoid of sclera or iris. He gripped her armored sleeve with surprising strength. He did not speak a language, but the translation matrix in her earpiece caught a faint, dying whisper. His name was Iron Saul. He was not a soldier. He was a keeper of records, a librarian of the stars. "They are coming!" Iron gasped. He died on the cold deck plating. The moment his heart stopped, the nightmare truly began. A subdermal node implanted deep within Iron's chest flared with blinding white light. It bypassed the Rookfall's quarantine network in a fraction of a millisecond. It did not just upload, it detonated. Terabytes of heavily compressed, ancient data surged from the dead alien and infected the entire human communications grid. Every terminal, every civilian datapad, every dormant holovid screen on Nysa Verge woke up. They flashed with alien ciphers, shifting geometric patterns, and raw, unfiltered truth. The data cache had been waiting. It needed a catalyst. It needed a species connected enough to spread it instantly. Exactly 40 seconds after the broadcast began, the silver tear in the sky shattered wide open. The fleet emerged. They did not look like ships. They looked like monolithic needles forged from dark glass and frozen shadows. They possessed no visible engines, no exhaust trails, no heat signatures. They simply existed, violating every known law of physics. This was the Cinder Choir. Tamsin had heard the rumors in the deep space cantinas. Everyone had. The Cinder Choir were the boogeymen of the cosmos, the ultimate killers. They were not conquerors. They were an executioner caste, wiping out entire civilizations with terrifying precision under the guise of legal mandate. They were the ones who cleaned the universe of its mistakes. A transmission hijacked the Rookfall's internal speakers. It echoed across the entire colony of Nysa Verge. The voice was synthesized, mathematical, devoid of any malice or anger. It was the sound of a falling guillotine. Contagion detected. Unauthorized access to localized truth data confirmed. All biological entities exposed to the broadcast are hereby classified as vectors of infection. Surrender the infected biospheres within 24 minutes for sanitized processing. Non-compliance will result in immediate localized extinction. May the silent void embrace your compliance. The bridge of the Rookfall fell deathly silent. On the planet below, millions of humans stopped breathing. The realization crashed down on Tamsin like a physical weight. Humanity was not being invaded for its water, its land, or its resources. They were being eradicated because a dead librarian had forced them to look at a secret that the universe wanted buried. 24 minutes, the helmsman whispered, staring at the countdown that had suddenly materialized on every screen. They aren't waiting, Tamsin said, her eyes locked on the tactical radar. A single, jagged pod detached from the nearest choir needle. It moved with sickening speed, completely ignoring the colony's gravitational pull. It was heading straight for the Rookfall. They were coming for the source of the broadcast. They were coming to sanitize the room. "Evasive maneuvers!" Tamsin roared. "Thrusters are locked!" The impact shook the escort ship to its titanium bones. Breach alarms wailed in a deafening crescendo. The internal sensors flared red. Boarders in the lower cargo bay. Tamsin drew her sidearm, a heavy kinetic pistol that felt pitifully small in her hand. She sprinted from the bridge, boots pounding against the grated deck, sliding down the maintenance ladders toward the breach. She reached the cargo bay just as the blast doors gave way. The intruders stepped through the smoke. They were tall, encased in seamless, matte black armor that absorbed the emergency lighting. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized fluidity. No wasted motion, no hesitation. Perfect, emotionless angels of death. The lead figure raised a weapon that hummed with a sickly, violet energy. Tamsin did not seek cover. She did not freeze in awe or terror. She looked past the intruders, her eyes catching the manual firing console for the ship's primary defense measure. A crude, industrial magnetic mass driver used for clearing heavy space debris. She dove across the catwalk, her hand slamming down on the analog release lever. The mass driver did not fire a delicate beam of energy. It fired a solid, 100-pound slug of depleted uranium at a fraction of the speed of light. The deafening boom ruptured the eardrums of everyone in the bay. The kinetic force tore through the ship's own internal bulkheads, ripping the air from the room. The uranium slug caught the lead executioner squarely in the chest. The impact was catastrophic. The seamless black armor shattered like cheap glass. The perfect killer was violently ripped apart, thrown backward with enough force to dent the outer hull. Silence rushed back into the room, save for the hiss of escaping oxygen. Tamsin slowly pushed herself up from the deck, her ears ringing, her breath ragged. She looked at the wreckage. The invincible entity was dead. But what shocked her was not just the victory. It was what painted the torn metal of the bulkhead. Blood. Thick, crimson, biological blood. They were not gods. They were not ghosts. They were flesh and bone beneath the dark armor. And if they could bleed, Tamsin Vale realized with a cold, terrifying clarity, they could be killed. The countdown clock on the wall ticked down. 21 minutes remaining. The war for humanity's right to exist had just begun. The digital decapitation of the colony took exactly 3.4 seconds. The Cinder Choir's algorithmic warfare doctrine dictated that a biological species reliant on a centralized network would instantly collapse into terminal panic the moment its primary data hubs were vaporized. Without central coordination, the enemy believed humanity would simply scatter like mindless insects, waiting to be systematically eradicated by the orbital sweepers. They were wrong. Nysa Verge was an agricultural frontier world, battered by seasonal electromagnetic storms that routinely fried anything relying on delicate microchips. The people here did not just survive without a central grid, they had built an entire culture around its absence. As the sleek, silent needles of the executioner fleet blotted out the burning silver sky, the digital silence was violently shattered by the roar of the analog age. Mechanical air raid sirens, powered by hand cranks and crude combustion engines, began to wail from the rooftops of the processing plants. Red magnesium flares shot into the choking atmosphere, painting the smoke with thick, bloody streaks. Messenger trucks, running on unhackable internal combustion, tore out of subterranean garages, kicking up clouds of dust as they carried hastily scribbled chalkboards to the outer sectors. The blackout was not a death sentence. It was a language the colony already spoke fluently. Down in the chaotic belly of the Rookfall, Tamsin Vale grabbed a heavy, wired microphone connected to a shortwave analog transmitter. It was a piece of junk she kept for emergencies, operating on a frequency so archaic the choir's hyper-advanced sensors would likely dismiss it as background radiation. "Listen to me, every Verge station," Tamsin's voice cracked through the static, echoing out of tinny, battery-powered radios across the sprawling farmlands. "The central chain of command is gone. Do not try to re-establish it. I repeat, do not look for a leader. We are breaking into micro-resistance pockets. Right now, groups of 30 to 50 people, maximum. You hold your sector. You do not communicate with the neighboring cells. If they do not know what we are doing, they cannot break our entire strategy at once. Make them fight 1,000 tiny wars." Across the agricultural sectors, her words became immediate doctrine. There was no time for debate. In Sector 4, an infrastructure engineer named Roa Keene listened to the broadcast while standing knee-deep in a flooded hydroponic bay. He looked up at the descending dropships of the choir, then down at the massive pressurized liquid nitrogen tanks used for flash freezing the grain harvests. "Blow the main irrigation valves," Roa shouted to his panicked crew, his voice raw. "Pump the liquid nitrogen straight into the surface thermal vents. All of it." Within minutes, the vast, grid-like fields of Nysa Verge transformed into a nightmare for the enemy's targeting computers. Roa and his team created a sprawling, chaotic maze of false thermal blooms and freezing vapor pockets. The choir's automated execution pods, designed to track precise biological heat signatures with surgical accuracy, suddenly found themselves blinded by a massive, fluctuating thermal soup. Guided munitions slammed into empty fertilizer silos, mistaking the residual heat for huddled masses of humans. Meanwhile, the expected stampede of terrified civilians never materialized. The Cinder Choir had calculated that fear would choke the evacuation routes, creating massive kill zones. They had not accounted for military medic Cell Arden. Instead of ordering a retreat, Cell hijacked the primary grain distribution hub, a massive, reinforced concrete bunker, and declared it a mobile triage center. He used pneumatic transport tubes to distribute medical supplies, turning the very veins of the colony's infrastructure into a lifeline. Because the wounded were immediately pulled out of sight and treated behind feet of solid concrete, the panic did not spread. The civilians did not run aimlessly. They grabbed what they could carry and vanished into the predetermined fallout shelters, guided by the steady, calm voices of medics and local foremen. Back aboard the grounded Rookfall, Tamsin rushed into the makeshift medical bay. The air smelled of ozone and antiseptic. On the primary operating table lay Iron Sol. His heart had stopped earlier, leading Tamsin to believe he was dead. But the alien's physiology possessed a terrifyingly efficient stasis mechanism. The violent purging of the data cache had triggered a temporary biological shutdown to protect his nervous system. Now, his chest was rising and falling with shallow, ragged breaths. His pitch-black eyes fixed on Tamsin as she approached. The translation matrix crackled to life in her ear. "The broadcast," Iron whispered, his voice sounding like dry leaves scraping across stone. "It is out. They will burn this world to ash to scrub it." "What did you give us?" Tamsin demanded, leaning over the metal table. "They called it a contagion. They called it truth data." Iron coughed, a thick, iridescent fluid bubbling at the corner of his pale lips. "It is a record, a sealed court tribunal. For thousands of generations, the Cinder Choir has operated under the guise of maintaining cosmic balance. They claim to execute only those species that posed a direct, militaristic threat to the galactic core. But it was a lie. The data proves they have slaughtered countless peaceful civilizations. They did not kill them to preserve order. They killed them to bury evidence." "Evidence of what?" "An ancient terror," Iron wheezed, his fragile hands trembling. "A primordial threat that slumbers beyond the edge of known space. The Choir is terrified of it. They annihilate anyone who even accidentally discovers its existence. Your people saw the record. You are no longer just a target. You are an anomaly that must be erased before you speak." Tamsin stared at the diagnostic monitors. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. If they simply fortified Nysa Verge, if they managed to miraculously survive the next few hours, humanity was still doomed. The Cinder Choir would just bring larger weapons. They would crack the planet in half to ensure the secret remained buried. Survival was no longer about hiding. It was about making sure the secret was too loud to silence. "If we keep it to ourselves, we die in the dark," Tamsin muttered. She turned to her communications officer, who was desperately trying to patch a line through the atmospheric jamming. "Reroute the ship's main power back to the deep space transmitter. Bypass the safety limiters. I want that data package copied and fired at every human colony within 10 light-years. Earth, Mars, the Jovian outposts. All of them." "Captain, if we drop the localized jamming shields to broadcast, the Choir will instantly pinpoint our exact coordinates," the officer warned, his hands hovering over the terminal. "Do it," Tamsin commanded, her tone leaving no room for argument. "We are already dead if that data does not leave this rock." The Rookfall shuddered as its power reserves were drained to feed the massive communication array. A concentrated beam of raw, unencrypted data punched through the electronic warfare blanket the Cinder Choir had draped over the planet. It was a flare shot into the dark forest of the galaxy, carrying the forbidden history of the executioners. High above the surface, the eastern floating city of Oakhaven, the wealthy, technologically advanced crown jewel of the colony, was finally breached. A squadron of prime executioners, the elite vanguard of the Choir, breached the towering glass spires, expecting to find the centralized servers and the panicked remnants of the planetary elite. They burst through the heavy blast doors of the mayoral palace, their weapons humming with lethal intent, ready to sanitize the ruling class. The grand hall was completely empty. The servers had been physically ripped from their housing units. The data cables hung like severed arteries from the ceiling. The lavish living quarters, the commercial sectors, the subterranean transit stations, all were abandoned. Over 200,000 citizens, along with every crucial piece of hardware, had simply vanished into the deep, unmapped geothermal mining tunnels hours before the blockade tightened. The elegant floating city was nothing but a hollow decoy, a ghost town left behind to waste the enemy's time. Aboard the monolithic command dreadnought anchored in low orbit, the Choir's strategic overmind processed the incoming telemetry. The algorithms calculated the variables, the thermal camouflage in the agricultural sectors, the decentralized resistance, the successful off-world transmission of the forbidden data, the completely evacuated eastern city. For the first time in over 4,000 cycles of continuous, flawless operation, the tactical predictor failed to generate a definitive timeline for total eradication. The perfect execution was unraveling in the face of absolute, stubborn chaos. A single, cold line of text appeared on the crystalline displays of the Cinder Choir's central campaign interface. It was a phrase that had never been necessary in the entire recorded history of their merciless crusades. Containment incomplete. 4 months after the sky burned over the agricultural belts, Dr. Leora Quinn sat in a subterranean bunker half a mile beneath the ruins of Geneva. The air recyclers hummed a monotonous tune, filtering out the radioactive ash that now blanketed the surface of Earth. Leora was a biological warfare analyst. Her job was not to fire weapons, but to dissect the anatomy of the war itself. On her desk sat a finalized intelligence dossier, synthesized from 19 distinct planetary fronts. It was a dense, 70-page document filled with raw telemetry, intercepted neuroacoustics, and battlefield casualty reports. When she uploaded the file to the heavily encrypted servers of Earth Command, it did not just shift military doctrine, it shattered the entire foundational understanding of the enemy. Her opening thesis was blunt, clinical, and terrifying. The Cinder Choir was not losing the technological arms race. Humanity had not miraculously closed a gap of 10,000 years of scientific evolution. The enemy's plasma lances still vaporized human dreadnoughts in exactly 4 seconds. Their slipspace capabilities remained entirely unchallenged. Their logistical supply chains were mathematically flawless. If this were a conventional war fought on spreadsheets and pure kinetic output, the human race should have been completely eradicated within the first 6 weeks. Yet, the executioners were failing. Leora's report proved that the choir was bleeding because they were being violently dragged into an ecosystem of warfare their perfect systems had never been taught to comprehend. Leora devoted the second section of her report to deconstructing the enemy's core operational doctrine. The Cinder Choir operated on a universal, socio-biological algorithm. Their entire existence was predicated on the assumption that civilization was a fragile pyramid. According to their historical data, if you severed the head of a government, shattered the global communication grids, and reduced the statistical probability of survival to below 3%, the target species would simply break. The prey would enter a state of systemic shock, embrace docile resignation, and wait for the executioners to sanitize the world. Human beings, Leora noted, with a grim sense of pride, did not follow this algorithm. When the grand, elegant structures of human society were vaporized, humanity did not crumble into compliant dust. It splintered, and those splinters became incredibly sharp. Without a central command telling them what to do, thousands of feral, localized micro-societies spontaneously generated out of the wreckage. These pockets of resistance were completely disorganized, heavily armed, and aggressively stubborn. They possessed no unified strategy, which meant they offered no single structural weak point for the enemy to exploit. To the Cinder Choir, trying to eradicate humanity was like trying to surgically remove a cancer that kept mutating its genetic code every 5 minutes. The medical telemetry section of the report made the flag officers at Earth Command physically uncomfortable. Leora pulled raw data from orbital marine deployments and civilian militia final stands. The tactical predictive models of the Cinder Choir operated on strict, rational biological thresholds. When an organic unit suffered a critical loss of blood volume, or when its central nervous system registered a pain index of 8 out of 10, the enemy algorithms classified that unit as completely incapacitated. The threat was mathematically neutralized. The human nervous system, however, possessed an override switch built on adrenaline, synthesized combat stimulants, and pure, unfiltered spite. Leora attached verified thermal footage of a human mechanic on the icy moon of Tyrell. The man had 2 severed kinetic arteries and a crushed spine. Yet, he dragged himself through an active radiation zone for 20 minutes, just to manually detonate a civilian fusion core beneath an enemy vanguard. To the Cinder Choir, this was a physiological impossibility. They were fighting biological entities that simply refused to acknowledge they were already dead. This physical resilience fed directly into the psychological data, which was even more devastating to the enemy's framework. The Cinder Choir relied heavily on probability matrices. They expected rational actors to make rational choices to prolong their own lives. But as the human survival rate approached absolute zero, human tactical doctrine abandoned self-preservation entirely. Humans began to embrace suicidal audacity. A stranded cargo pilot rammed a crippled freighter full of raw fertilizer into a pristine enemy dreadnought. A besieged planetary governor intentionally dropped an orbital tether onto her own occupied capital city just to crush the enemy staging grounds. The enemy's supercomputers could not predict irrational malice. When faced with these impossible, chaotic variables, the executioners did not adapt. They froze. Leora's data proved that the rigid adherence to protocol caused the enemy's operational tempo to plummet violently whenever the uncertainty ratio increased. They suffered from catastrophic analysis paralysis. The absolute breakthrough of Leora's investigation came in Section 4. By compiling decrypted sensor ghosts and analyzing the microscopic delays in enemy reaction times across a dozen war zones, she finally mapped the architecture of their command structure. The Cinder Choir did not use radios, laser arrays, or standard quantum entanglement to communicate. They utilized a localized neural resonance network. Leora officially designated it the Kill Song. It was a telepathic, algorithmic symphony that linked the minds of every enemy unit across a battlefield. When an execution went according to plan, the Kill Song was a masterpiece of synchronized slaughter. It granted the enemy flawless hive mind reflexes and perfect spatial awareness. But Leora discovered its fatal vulnerability. The network required absolute harmony to function. When the Kill Song encountered too many irrational variables, a severed human holding a live grenade, a civilian driving a harvesting combine into a localized energy shield, a mathematically impossible ambush, the harmony broke. The localized confusion did not just affect the immediate squad. The dissonance rippled backward through the neural network. The Kill Song inadvertently transmitted localized panic and system errors across their entire planetary force. This revelation led to the most absurd, yet rigorously verified, tactical recommendation in human military history. An accidental field test on the bombarded mining colony of Tartarus had already proven the theory. A desperate human communications technician, trying to drown out the enemy's psychological warfare broadcasts, had jury-rigged a massive planetary distress beacon to play a looping, uncompressed audio file. It was a chaotic, overlapping mix of heavy industrial percussion, distorted classical symphonies, and an incredibly loud, decades-old commercial advertisement for a synthetic energy drink. The sheer acoustic and electromagnetic garbage of the broadcast created a localized dissonance bubble. It acted like a neurological virus on the Kill Song. The perfect executioners operating within the broadcast zone suddenly lost their synchronization. Their immaculate formations staggered. They missed their shots. They hesitated for crucial milliseconds. Human trash culture had successfully jammed a hyper-advanced neural network. Leora Quinn typed the final paragraph of her report. She knew these words would be ripped from the document, painted onto the blasted armor of tank battalions, etched into the bulkheads of dying frigates, and whispered by civilians hiding in the deep dark of the earth. It was the absolute truth of their survival, boiled down to a single, undeniable doctrine. Humanity is not stronger than them. Humanity is just more chaotic. And in this war, chaos is armor. The strike team floated through the debris field of the dust halo. The silence of the void was absolute. Ahead, the crippled Cinder Choir dreadnought drifted like a severed leviathan. Half of its monolithic glass-like hull had been sheared off by the localized gravity traps Tamsin Vale had laid 3 days prior. Her objective was not destruction. It was theft. They needed an intact command core. Tamsin signaled her breach squad. Their magnetic boots clamped onto the pristine, dark alloy of the enemy hull. The plasma cutters ignited, burning a precise circle into the outer airlock. When the heavy seal gave way, they stepped into a space that defied every human architectural doctrine. It did not feel like a warship. It felt like a mechanical cathedral. The interior corridors were staggeringly vast, vaulted like ancient Gothic temples, yet completely devoid of ornamentation. Every surface was a matte, light-absorbing obsidian. The architecture was perfectly symmetrical, terrifyingly precise. There were no exposed wires, no utility panels, no signs of the messy biological maintenance that plagued human vessels. The air itself tasted sterile, scrubbed of all organic scent. As the team pushed deeper toward the bridge, they bypassed automated security nodes. The terminals did not display tactical data or navigational charts. They scrolled streams of algorithmic chants. The translation matrix in Tamsin's ear rendered the alien code into spoken English. They were not operational commands. They were prayers. They were litanies dedicated to the absolute eradication of variance. Praise the zero, sanctify the predictable, eliminate the anomaly. This was a civilization that had elevated the concept of statistical perfection into a fanatical religion. The team reached the primary sanctum, the alien equivalent of a command bridge. The massive navigation core pulsed with a dim, dying violet light in the center of the room. Slumped against the control altar was a high-ranking officer. Its dark, seamless armor was cracked, leaking thick, iridescent fluid onto the perfect floor. Standard operating procedure for the enemy dictated immediate biological self-termination upon critical system failure or capture. Tamsin raised her heavy kinetic rifle, expecting the creature to detonate. It did not. The alien simply sat there, its black, void-like eyes tracking her movement. Tamsin gestured for her technicians to secure the glowing core. She approached the bleeding commander. The translation matrix engaged. His designation was Vialtier. He was the first of the executioners to ever be taken alive. "Why are you still breathing?" Tamsin asked, her voice echoing in the cavernous, silent room. "Your doctrine demands you purge yourself." Vialtier exhaled a rattling breath. "The doctrine is flawed. I have seen the math break. I choose the anomaly." Over the next 2 hours, trapped inside the dying husk of the cathedral ship, Tamsin and her technical team bypassed the heavily encrypted localized data drives using the biological bypass of Vialtier's own command suit. The information that spilled onto their portable screens reshaped the entire geometry of the war. The Cinder Choir was not an empire expanding its borders. They possessed no citizens, no art, no culture outside of their holy mandate. They were a galactic immune system, an authorized execution force engineered millennia ago to amputate diseased limbs from the cosmos. They wiped out civilizations that their Supreme Council designated as localized, existential risks. But the deeper Tamsin dug into the restricted, heavily partitioned archives, the colder her blood ran. The death sentences handed down by the Supreme Council were built on a foundation of lies. Hundreds of eradicated species, painted as violent aggressors or biological hazards in the official records, had actually been completely peaceful. Their only crime was looking in the wrong direction. The Cinder Choir had not murdered them to preserve cosmic order. They had murdered them to silence them. "What did they see?" Tamsin demanded, turning the data screen toward the captured commander. "What is your council hiding?" Vialtier slowly lifted his head. They hid the edge, the dark boundary. The translated files revealed the ultimate, terrifying truth about humanity's death warrant. The Cinder Choir did not target Earth because humans were chaotic or inherently dangerous to the galactic stability. They targeted Earth because of a physics experiment. 4 years ago, human scientists at the Olympus Mons facility had initiated their first successful faster-than-light slipspace fold. The event was incredibly brief, lasting less than 2 seconds. But the harmonic frequency generated by that specific drive core was a catastrophic accident. It was not just a method of travel. It was a precise acoustic signature. "You struck the bell," Vialtier whispered, the translation matrix catching the raw dread in his tone. "The entity that dwells beyond the outer pale, the predator that slumbers in the intergalactic void. It is blind, but it listens for that exact frequency. It uses that resonance to find its prey." Humanity had not just picked a fight with the ultimate killers of the galaxy. By turning on their faster-than-light engine, they had accidentally stumbled over the tripwire of a primordial alarm system. The entire galaxy had spent thousands of generations burying that frequency, outlawing its use, and annihilating anyone who accidentally rediscovered it, all to keep the predator in the dark. The Cinder Choir's Supreme Council was terrified. They had dispatched the fleet to Nysa Verge to burn humanity to ash before the human race could ring the bell a second time and draw the attention of the thing waiting in the deep black. "If your council knew the truth, why lie to your own people?" Tamsin asked, her grip tightening on her rifle. "Why pretend it is about statistical perfection?" "Because fear fractures the song," Vialtier replied. "If the ranks knew what truly waited in the dark, the collective neural resonance would shatter. The terror would consume us from within. The Supreme Council maintains the lie of holy execution to keep the soldiers blind, focused, and effective." The alien commander leaned forward, his black eyes staring intently at the human officer. "But the lie is failing. There are entire factions within our ranks, the silent choirs, who have begun to hear the dissonance. We have doubted the council for a century. We know they are executing the innocent to cover their own cowardice. Yet, no one dared to break the system, because the fear of the council was absolute. Until you..." Tamsin looked at the stolen violet core humming in the containment crate. She looked at the captured commander, a broken cog in a supposedly perfect machine. The scope of the conflict expanded violently in her mind. This was no longer just a desperate war for planetary defense against an invading armada. If the Supreme Council of the Cinder Choir maintained their iron grip through the suppression of this secret, then exposing that secret would shatter their entire civilization from the inside out. But doing so meant risking the attention of the nightmare lurking beyond the edge of the galaxy. The immediate fight was not just about survival. It was a brutal, high-stakes war for the monopoly on the truth. And Tamsin Vale had just stolen the master key. The military-industrial complex did not save humanity. The civilian sector did. When the traditional orbital shipyards burned during the opening weeks of the invasion, Earth Command realized a terrifying truth. They could never outproduce the Cinder Choir. They could not match the flawless, zero-waste manufacturing capabilities of a civilization entirely dedicated to execution. So, humanity stopped trying to fight a symmetrical war. They dismantled the concept of a centralized military entirely. In its place, a decentralized, anarchic logistical web was born. They called it the ragline. It was a supply chain with no capital, no central hub, and no flagship. If the Cinder Choir destroyed a major military staging ground, it did not matter, because the real ammunition was being ferried by 1 million civilian vessels, operating completely off the grid. The entire human species transformed into a sprawling, interlocking machine of resistance. Asteroid miners in the outer belts stopped hauling titanium for luxury cruisers. They began welding thick slabs of raw, unrefined slag onto the hulls of their cargo barges, turning them into massive, ugly floating shields and decoy targets. Agricultural engineers took the massive soil processing engines used for terraforming dead moons and recalibrated them. Instead of churning dirt, these colossal machines were retrofitted into makeshift cannons that fired dense clouds of polarized dust into the upper atmosphere, permanently blinding the enemy's gravity targeting sensors. The most bizarre adaptation came from the entertainment sector. Acoustic engineers who previously designed soundscapes for massive, open-air theater productions and zero-gravity concert halls were drafted. They understood wave interference better than most weapons developers. Working in damp, underground workshops, they built crude but devastating audio jammers designed specifically to fracture the telepathic kill song. The war room no longer belonged exclusively to four-star generals. It was invaded by civilian programmers, algorithmic traders, and competitive online tactical simulation players. These were minds trained not in traditional military academies, but in the chaotic, hyper-fast environments of digital arenas. They did not read the Cinder Choir's movements as battlefield maneuvers. They read them as lines of code with exploitable physics. They analyzed the flawless predictive models of the enemy and found the lag. They turned intuitive game sense into a weapon of mass destruction, predicting exactly how the executioners would rubber band when presented with conflicting variables. Tamsin Vale took this tidal wave of civilian ingenuity and weaponized it into an official doctrine. She called it Break the Song. The rules of engagement were entirely rewritten. Human fleets were expressly forbidden from flying in symmetrical formations. Artillery barrages were randomized, never adhering to a predictable tempo. Commanders were ordered to intentionally make suboptimal tactical choices, just to force the enemy's predictive algorithms to constantly recalculate. They never gave the Cinder Choir the right to guess their next move for more than 5 seconds. The universe noticed. For thousands of years, the lesser species of the galaxy had hidden in the dark, watching the Cinder Choir erase entire civilizations with cold, mathematical perfection. They had believed the executioners were invincible gods of death. But humanity was bleeding them. Humanity was mocking them. Slowly, the silence of the galaxy began to break. It started as anonymous data packets slipped into human convoys. Then came the physical dead drops. A stealth-shielded barge left abandoned near a human mining colony, packed to the brim with rare fissile materials. Encrypted files containing forgotten hyperspace corridors that bypassed the enemy's blockade lines. Hand-drawn, ancient maps of the galactic rim from a reptilian species that had pretended to be pre-industrial just to avoid the choir's gaze. For the first time in recorded history, the galaxy was financing a rebellion. The turning point, the moment the myth of the ultimate killers shattered completely, occurred at Morrow Basin. Morrow Basin was a massive orbital metropolis, a spinning ring of glass and steel that housed nearly 10 million souls. When a vanguard fleet of the Cinder Choir's most elite executioners moved to sanitize it, humanity did not mount a heroic defense. They evacuated every single citizen 3 days prior. When the sleek, dark needles of the enemy fleet breached the atmosphere, they found a ghost town. But it was a ghost town rigged by the collective malice of an entire species. As the enemy ships glided into the central atrium of the orbital ring, the trap snapped shut. The stage engineers activated a network of 100,000 audio jammers simultaneously, but they did not play static. They played a fractured, repeating echo of the Cinder Choir's own kill song, perfectly out of phase. The neural dissonance was catastrophic. Simultaneously, the agricultural dust cannons hidden in the residential sectors fired, filling the enclosed space of the orbital ring with polarized, heavy metal fog. The city's architectural mirrors, normally used to direct sunlight to the parks, wildly reflected the thermal signatures of the enemy ships back onto themselves. The Cinder Choir's flawless combat algorithms collapsed under the weight of the sensory paradox. Their targeting computers locked onto the false thermal ghosts. The corrupted kill song fed them panic disguised as tactical data. In the chaotic dark of Morrow Basin, the elite executioners did the impossible. They opened fire on each other. Human scouts watched from a safe distance as the dark glass needles tore themselves apart in a frenzy of friendly fire. The perfectly disciplined angels of death flailed like blind animals caught in a snare. The entire engagement lasted less than 40 minutes. Humanity won a decisive, fleet-breaking victory without firing a single conventional weapon. The footage of the Morrow Basin trap was broadcast across the galaxy. The message was clear: the ultimate killers were not gods. They were just bullies who had never encountered an enemy who knew how to laugh in the dark. An enemy willing to take insane risks. An enemy who could dismantle the rules of war and use the pieces to bash their skulls in. There was celebration on Earth. There was hope. But aboard her command carrier, Tamsin Vale felt a cold dread settling in her stomach as she reviewed the after-action telemetry. The acoustic and electromagnetic feedback loop generated to shatter the kill song at Morrow Basin had been incredibly powerful. It had not just bounced around the orbital ring. The raw, unfiltered resonance had spiked, echoing out through the hyperspace lanes, tearing through the cosmic background radiation. Deep in the outer pale, thousands of light-years beyond the charted edge of the galaxy, the dark void shifted. Ancient, slumbering monitoring stations, built from bone-white alloy and encrusted with the frost of 1,000,000 years, detected the spike. Power relays that had been dark since the dawn of the universe suddenly flared to life. Colossal, mechanical eyes slowly began to rotate inward, calibrating their lenses, drawn by the sudden, violent noise. Humanity had turned themselves into a weapon loud enough to shatter the Cinder choir. But in doing so, they had rung the bell a second time. And this time, it was loud enough to wake the predator that the rest of the universe had spent eternity trying to hide from. Tamsin had won the immediate front, but she had just dragged the entire story into a nightmare of an infinitely larger scale. Fleet Commander Tamsin Vale stood on the observation deck of her flagship, staring into the swirling, violent nebulae that framed the glass gate. This was the most critical hyperspace choke point in the sector, a narrow cosmic artery that connected the inner colonies to the wider galactic transit network. The Cinder choir had recognized its strategic value immediately. They had parked their absolute finest armada here, an impenetrable wall of their most elite executioners, intending to choke the human counteroffensive before it could even begin to spread. Command back on Earth wanted a battering ram. The Admiralty had authorized Tamsin to sacrifice half her fleet in a glorious, brutal charge to break the blockade. They believed momentum was their only advantage. Tamsin ignored them. She knew that throwing raw tonnage against a mathematically perfect defense was suicide. Instead of a hammer, she chose to use a scalpel made of pure psychological torture. She ordered the vanguard to advance at full burn, weapons hot, painting the enemy dreadnoughts with targeting lasers. Then, at the very edge of effective firing range, she ordered a violent, synchronized full reverse. 10 minutes later, a flanking squadron darted toward the enemy's left flank, only to execute a hard stop and power down their main drives completely, drifting like dead iron. She repeated this maddening dance for 6 agonizing hours. The strategy exploited a fundamental flaw in the Cinder choir's operational soul. Their autonomous targeting systems and command algorithms were heavily restricted by their own religious doctrine of perfect execution. They required a kill probability of exactly 99.7% before committing their main batteries to a definitive strike. If a target possessed even a fractional chance of evasion or unpredicted survival, the system would withhold fire to recalculate, terrified of introducing an error into their holy record. Tamsin weaponized that threshold. She orchestrated her entire fleet to hover precisely at a 99.4% probability of destruction. She kept everything exactly 0.3% short of certainty. The enemy supercomputers spun into endless, agonizing loops, calculating and recalculating the shifting vectors, but never authorizing the kill stroke. They were paralyzed by their own demand for absolute perfection. To compound the enemy's processing nightmare, human engineers flooded the void with thousands of synthetic biological signatures. They rigged automated tugs to drag massive chains of hollowed-out ore freighters, painting the hulls with radioactive isotopes to spoof the heat signatures of dreadnought engine cores. Marine boarding parties launched in stealth pods, rapidly swapping their transponder codes and call signs mid-flight. They created a tangled, impossible web of overlapping command hierarchies. The kill song, the enemy's telepathic neural network, choked on the sheer volume of unclosed combat scenarios. The symphony of the executioners devolved into a stuttering, confused hum. But the ultimate advantage did not come from human ingenuity. It came from a whisper in the dark. 3 hours before the engagement reached its boiling point, an encrypted tight beam transmission materialized on Tamsin's personal console. It was not human code. It bypassed the standard military firewalls with alarming ease. The file contained a localized synchronization schedule for the enemy's interlocking defensive grid, detailing the exact microsecond their shields cycled to dump thermal waste. The sender identified themselves only as a dissonant chord. It was a faction of defectors within the enemy ranks, an anti-war choir composed of soldiers who had completely lost faith in their Supreme Council after witnessing the resilience of humanity. They were handing Tamsin the keys to the fortress. When the tactical window opened for exactly 1.5 seconds, Tamsin finally struck. She did not order a general advance. She drove a single, hyper-concentrated wedge of heavy cruisers directly into the thermal seam of the enemy formation. The perfectly aligned blockade shattered like a pane of brittle ice. The Cinder choir, paralyzed by the conflicting data, the stuttering kill song, and the sudden, impossible breach of their shields, lost all cohesion. Their flawless lines broke. They began a chaotic, uncoordinated retreat. Tactical doctrine dictated immediate pursuit. Earth Command screamed over the long-range communications to slaughter them all, to grind the fleeing armada into dust, and send a message of absolute terror to the galaxy. Tamsin looked at the primary sensor board. Trapped behind the crumbling blockade were dozens of civilian merchant vessels of alien origin, caught in the crossfire while trying to navigate the gate. Interspersed among them were heavily damaged choir frigates, venting atmosphere and life support into the vacuum. Tamsin hit the fleet-wide broadcast. She ordered her gunners to power down their main batteries. Instead of an execution, she ordered her vanguard to form a massive, heavily armored defensive wall. She opened a wide corridor through the wreckage. She broadcast an open-channel directive, allowing the terrified alien merchants to flee the combat zone safely. More devastatingly, she allowed the critically damaged enemy frigates to limp away into the void unbothered. This act of mercy was not just born of compassion. It was a devastating psychological strike. It proved to the watching galaxy, and to the fleeing enemy soldiers, that humanity was not the rabid, chaotic monster the Supreme Council claimed them to be. The moral architecture of the Cinder Choir collapsed another structural level. How could they justify exterminating a species that had just shown them mercy in the middle of a slaughter? The glass gate was secured. The human fleet held the most vital intersection in the sector. But as Tamsin reviewed the post-battle intelligence, the victory tasted like cold ash. A follow-up transmission from the dissonant chord arrived, explaining their treason. The defectors had not betrayed their council because they feared human firepower, nor did they wish for humanity to conquer their empire. They handed over the gate because the war itself was a beacon. Every prolonged battle, every shattered neural link, every massive deployment of hyperspace weaponry across the front lines was actively amplifying the anomalous signal bleeding out from the galactic rim. The dissidents wanted the human fleet to win quickly, to end the conflict immediately, because the longer the galaxy burned with the chaotic energy of this war, the louder the dinner bell rang for the predator waiting in the deep black. The longer humanity fought, the faster the ancient threat was waking up. News of the victory, and the subsequent terrifying intelligence from the defectors, reached Earth. The unified front of humanity instantly and violently fractured. The Planetary Council split into two viciously opposed factions. The hardliners demanded a total war of annihilation, arguing that the Cinder Choir must be ground into absolute dust to secure human dominance before any new threat could arrive. The moderates pleaded for an immediate ceasefire and diplomatic back channels, desperate to ally with the defectors and extract every piece of data about the primordial threat before it crossed the galactic threshold. Standing on the bridge of her victorious flagship, surrounded by cheering officers, Tamsin Vale felt entirely alone. She was forced to confront an incredibly uncomfortable truth that no military academy ever taught. She had achieved a flawless tactical victory. But out here in the dark, a military victory did not automatically provide the right answer for survival. The war had evolved past shooting. It was now a terrifying race against a ticking clock that no one could see. The grand rotunda of the Galactic Assembly was a marvel of ancient, polished stone and cascading bioluminescent flora, designed to project an aura of eternal peace. For hundreds of years, it had hosted the vibrant debates of 1,000 distinct civilizations. Today, however, the air inside the colossal amphitheater was choked with a suffocating, paranoid silence. The representatives of the known galaxy were not looking at the human delegation with gratitude. They were looking at them with unvarnished, primal terror. To the assembled species, humanity was no longer a victim that had miraculously survived an execution. They were a thinking wildfire. Ambassador Iona Mercer walked down the central aisle toward the speaker's podium. She did not wear the ornate, jewel-encrusted robes of the inner core diplomats. She wore a sharply tailored, charcoal gray suit, her posture rigid, her expression carved from ice. She felt the weight of 1 billion eyes bearing down on her. The lesser species of the galaxy had spent centuries living under the terrifying, yet predictable, shadow of the Cinder Choir. The executioners were a natural disaster, a cosmic law that could be avoided if you simply kept your head down and obeyed the rules. Humanity had shattered that law. They had taken the apex predators of the universe, dragged them into the mud, and beaten them with chaotic, improvisational malice. And now, the galaxy was realizing that a species capable of breaking the ultimate killers might be infinitely more dangerous than the killers themselves. The chief delegate of the Sovereign Trade Coalition, a towering, multi-limbed avian draped in gold silks, activated his microphone. His voice echoed through the massive chamber, dripping with aristocratic dread. "The human anomaly has destabilized the foundational piece of this assembly," the delegate declared. "You have proven that the executioners can bleed. In doing so, you have invited anarchy into our carefully curated systems. We cannot allow a species so steeped in violence, so profoundly chaotic, to integrate into the wider diplomatic infrastructure. We propose a total, absolute quarantine of the Sol system and all its colonial holdings. We must build a wall around this fire before humanity becomes a louder, infinitely more destructive version of the very choir they fight." Murmurs of agreement swept through the tiered seating. Dozens of planetary representatives tapped their voting consoles in eager support. Iona Mercer reached the podium. She did not politely wait for her turn to speak. She slammed a heavy, physical data drive onto the polished obsidian surface. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot, silencing the hall instantly. "You want to build a wall," Iona said, her voice a low, dangerous hum that carried perfectly through the translation matrices. "You want to lock us away because we ruined your comfortable nightmare. You preferred the Cinder Choir. You preferred a galaxy where millions of innocents were quietly erased. As long as the executioners never knocked on your specific door, you call us chaotic. I call you cowards." She pressed a sequence on the podium. Massive holographic displays flared to life above the center of the rotunda. They did not show human casualty figures or battle footage. They showed the stolen ledgers retrieved from the disabled cathedral ship at the glass gate. "Look at the screens," Iona commanded. "These are the authorized eradication mandates from the last 2,000 years. Look at the names of the species the Cinder Choir wiped out. the silica weavers of the deep mantle, the harmonic mammalian enclaves of the woven colonies. Do you remember them? You sat in this very hall and watched them get erased. The official reports claimed they were developing illegal, galaxy-threatening temporal weapons. You believed it because it was convenient. The avian delegate puffed his feathers in defensive indignation. Those purges were investigated by independent. They were rubber-stamped by a terrified assembly too weak to demand the raw data. Iona cut him off violently. We have the raw data. They were not building temporal weapons. They were entirely peaceful. They were slaughtered to bury a secret. And you all looked the other way to preserve your own fragile safety. These are ancient tragedies. Ambassador Mercer, another delegate chimed in, a sleek amphibious creature from the watery core worlds. Waving the ghosts of extinct species in our faces does not change the fact that humanity is a current, active threat to galactic stability. They are not ghosts, Iona replied softly. Her eyes gleamed with a predatory sharpness. She sent a single, encrypted ping from her wrist console. At the far end of the rotunda, the heavy mahogany doors of the guest antechamber slowly swung open. The entire galactic assembly stopped breathing. Escorted by a squad of human marines in full dress uniform were two figures. One was a towering construct of crystalline silica, its internal light pulsing with a slow, mournful rhythm. The other was an elderly, cloaked mammalian, leaning heavily on a carved wooden staff. They were the living, breathing representatives of the two species Iona had just named. Species that the official galactic record had listed as completely extinct for over 90 years. Pandemonium erupted. Delegates shouted, slammed their fists on their desks, and scrambled to adjust their translation earpieces. The political shockwave was absolute. While Tamsin Vale had been busy breaking the enemy fleet at the Glass Gate, she had quietly utilized the sprawling, decentralized human ragline. Using the decryption keys stolen from the enemy commander, her civilian blockade runners had slipped deep into the uncharted dead zones of the galaxy, locating the stasis bunkers where a handful of survivors had hidden from the executioners for nearly a century. Tamsin had not just rescued them. She had weaponized their survival for this exact diplomatic moment. Iona waited for the shouting to die down. It took 3 full minutes. When she spoke again, she had them entirely by the throat. The illusion of the perfect executioners is dead, Iona stated, her voice slicing through the lingering whispers. And with it dies your authority to judge us. We did not come here to ask for your permission to exist. We did not come here to demand the 3 trillion credits in standard war reparations that cosmic law entitles us to. The mention of the astronomical sum caused several delegates to physically flinch. The human ambassador was waving away an economic fortune. Keep your money, Iona said, staring down the assembly president. We want the sealed archives. Every single classified report. Every buried sensor ghost. Every censored exploration log pertaining to the outer pale and the deep rim for the last 10,000 years. We want the vault open today. Because the thing the Cinder Choir is so terrified of is waking up, and you have spent millennia blinding yourselves to it. The vote was called immediately. It was a vicious, highly contested debate, but the presence of the resurrected species tipped the scales. The motion to open the sealed rim archives passed by a razor-thin margin of 51 to 49%. However, as Iona Mercer stepped down from the podium, she caught the eyes of her own military attachés standing in the shadows of the human delegation box. They were high-ranking intelligence officers and strategic planners. They did not look relieved. They looked hungry. This narrow victory had birthed a terrifying new faction within Earth Command, quietly naming themselves the Black Ledger Block. They had listened to the debate, observed the cowardice of the alien species, and come to a dark conclusion. If the galaxy was this weak, this easily manipulated by fear, then true stability could never be achieved through diplomacy. The Black Ledger Bloc believed that humanity should not simply dismantle the Cinder Choir. Humanity needed to take the choir's place. They whispered that the only way to ensure human survival was to seize the executioner's perfect weaponry and hold the leash of the galaxy in their own hands. Hours later, in a heavily shielded communications bunker, light years away from the political theater, Tamsin Vale sat in the dark. The monitor, casting a pale blue glow across her tired face, displayed the very first decrypted data packet routed directly from the newly opened assembly archives. It was a compilation of deep space acoustic telemetry spanning thousands of cycles. It was the forbidden noise from the edge of the universe. Tamsin ran the raw audio through her tactical analyzer, stripping away the cosmic background radiation, the pulsar beats, and the solar winds. What remained was not the passive, ambient hum of a sleeping predator. It was a structured, rhythmic pulse. Her blood turned to ice as the analyzer spit out its conclusion. The signal was not just listening to the chaotic noise of the galactic war. It was actively measuring the distance. It was a sonar ping, pinging off the harmonic fractures in spacetime, calculating coordinates, and tightening its focus. The ultimate killers were never the Cinder Choir. The choir were just the terrified guards standing at the gate, desperate to keep everyone quiet. But humanity had kicked the gate open, and the true apex predator of the cosmos had finally locked onto their scent. The real war was only just beginning. The atmosphere of Syrexa did not taste of ash or blood. As the propaganda networks back on Earth had promised, it tasted of sterilized ozone and cold iron. The capital world of the Cinder Choir was not a monument to malice. It was a staggering, planetary-scale circuit board of matte black spires and perfectly illuminated geometric canyons. There was no weather. There were no oceans. The entire biosphere was an artificially regulated machine, designed to eliminate the variables of nature. Tamsin Vale stood on the balcony of the newly established Transitional Oversight Compound. Below her, the streets were filled with the citizens of the Executioner Empire. They did not riot. They did not weep for their shattered fleet. They moved in flawless, silent columns, dressed in uniform gray garments, marching to their designated habitation blocks. It was a society that had been lobotomized by extreme discipline. 5 weeks had passed since the ceasefire. Tamsin had been stripped of her fleet command and reassigned here as the chief human observer for the armistice transition. The politicians back home called it a peacekeeping mission. Tamsin knew it was a powder keg. Behind her, the heavy blast doors slid open. Vea Sar stepped into the observation room. Vea was not a soldier. She was a senior civilian infrastructure architect for the choir. Without the seamless black combat armor of her military caste, she looked strangely fragile. Her skin was the color of pale chalk, her void-like eyes reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights of the human compound. The atmospheric moisture scrubbers in Sector 4 have been successfully recalibrated, Vea reported, her voice flat, devoid of inflection. The nutrient paste distribution network is functioning at 94% efficiency. We are prepared for the next caloric cycle. Tamsin turned away from the balcony. You do not have to call it a caloric cycle. Vea, you can just call it dinner. Vea tilted her head slightly. A gesture Tamsin had learned indicated mild processing confusion. The terminology is irrelevant. The function is preservation. This was the hardest part of the post-war reality. The civilian populace of the Cinder Choir were not the monsters humanity had fought in the cold void. They were victims of their own Supreme Council, a people who had never been allowed to live. They had spent thousands of years existing solely as logistical support for a holy crusade they did not understand. Vea had spent her entire adult life designing supply chains, optimized for delivering munitions to the frontier. Now, under the terms of the ceasefire, she was being forced to use those exact same networks to distribute basic agricultural sustenance to her own starving people. She was having to learn from scratch. how to keep her civilization alive instead of helping it kill. Tamsin walked over to her desk, glancing at the datapad filled with incoming demands from Earth. The Planetary Council was screaming for brutal, crushing economic sanctions. They wanted to strip Cirexa of all heavy metals, dismantle their orbital foundries, and force the Choir into absolute economic dependency for the next 50 years. It was a punishment drafted out of vindictive fear. Tamsin had sent back a dozen scathing rebuttals, arguing that driving a highly disciplined, deeply traumatized civilization into humiliating poverty was the exact blueprint for starting a second war. "Show me the lower residential tiers," Tamsin said suddenly, grabbing her coat. "Not the sectors you prepared for the inspection teams. I want to see where your people go when the machines turn off." Vea hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. They descended deep into the subterranean levels of the capital, far beneath the polished, intimidating monoliths of the surface. The flawless geometry of the Cinder Choir began to break down. The corridors here were narrow, dimly lit by flickering lumen strips. The silence was still heavy, but it felt different. It felt secretive. Vea led Tamsin into a small, unmapped maintenance alcove, hidden behind a massive thermal vent. Inside, a group of Choir civilians sat in a tight circle. They did not flee when the human officer entered. They simply froze. Scattered on the floor were objects that defied every law of the executioner's strict utilitarian doctrine. There were small blocks of scrap metal, painstakingly carved into irregular, asymmetrical shapes. There was a length of industrial piping strung with tension wires, functioning as a crude acoustic instrument. There were pieces of synthetic fabric dyed in unauthorized shades of deep blue and muted crimson. "These items serve no function," Vea whispered, her voice barely audible. "They do not contribute to the execution mandate." The Supreme Council classified such creations as cognitive rot. Possession was punishable by immediate biological termination. Yet, my people hide them. They have always hidden them. Tamsin looked at the carved metal. It was art. It was clumsy, rigid, and born in total darkness. But it was an undeniable attempt to express a soul that the system had tried to crush. The Cinder Choir were not a hive mind of biological robots. They were prisoners in a cage built from terror. "They are trying to remember how to feel," Tamsin said softly. The profound, quiet moment was violently shattered by a sudden, deafening mechanical scream. The sound did not come from the alcove. It vibrated through the very bedrock of the planet. The lumen strips exploded in a shower of sparks. Tamsin's personal communication link flared red with priority overrides. She sprinted out of the alcove, Vea close behind. Tamsin tapped her earpiece. "Command, report. Was that a seismic event?" "Negative. Overseer Vale." The panicked voice of a human technician crackled through the comms. "It is the planetary resonance grid. The joint engineering teams were trying to repair the atmospheric shielding, but something hijacked the core routers. The grid is spooling up. It is broadcasting a hyperspace pulse." Tamsin's blood ran cold. "Shut it down. Cut the hard lines. We are locked out. The encryption is human military grade. It is bleeding through every firewall we have." Tamsin ran toward the nearest transit elevator, her mind racing. The planetary resonance grid was the massive, world-spanning antenna the Cinder Choir used to synchronize their fleets. If it was broadcasting blindly into the void, it was a beacon. When they reached the surface, the sky above Cirexa was no longer black. It was shifting, warping with nauseating shades of violet and bruised yellow. The grid was firing. Tamsin tore a diagnostic terminal from a nearby security checkpoint and slammed her override codes into the console. She needed to see the frequency the grid was broadcasting. The numbers aligned on the screen. It was an exact match. It was the precise, forbidden harmonic frequency that the human faster-than-light engines had accidentally triggered years ago. the exact acoustic signature that the deep space predator, Pale Vector, used to hunt. "We are tracking a massive return signal," the technician screamed over the comms. "It is coming from the outer Pale. It is moving faster than anything we have ever recorded. It heard us." Tamsin stared at the source code of the virus that had hijacked the grid. She recognized the digital architecture. It was not a remnant of the Cinder Choir's defense protocols. It was a localized sabotage program built in the subterranean labs of Earth Command. The Black Ledger Block. The horrifying realization slammed into her. The extremist human faction had not wanted peace. They had realized that the Galactic Assembly would never willingly hand absolute military authority over to humanity. To take control, the Black Ledger Block needed a crisis so catastrophic that the entire galaxy would beg them to rule. They had embedded operatives within the engineering transition teams. They had intentionally used the Choir's own massive homeworld grid to scream into the dark, ringing the bell to summon the ancient terror. They were going to let the Predator burn half the galaxy so they could crown themselves the saviors of the ashes. "We have to sever the primary power conduits," Tamsin said, turning to Vea. "If we do not stop that signal, your entire world is going to be the first thing that thing eats." Before Vea could respond, the heavy blast doors of the security checkpoint blew inward. A squad of human operatives stepped through the smoke. They wore unmarked tactical gear, their faces obscured by polarized visors. They were not here to help. They raised their kinetic rifles, the laser sights settling squarely on Tamsin's chest. The Black Ledger Block was cleaning up loose ends. They needed the human overseer dead, so they could blame the catastrophic broadcast on a rogue faction of the Cinder Choir, ensuring the armistice failed and the war resumed on their terms. Simultaneously, the city's internal alarms began to shriek. The remaining hardliner generals of the Cinder Choir, sensing the unauthorized frequency and the human weapons fire, had just activated the planetary defense militias. To the Choir hardliners, the human overseers had just broken the treaty and activated a doomsday weapon. Tamsin found herself caught in the ultimate crossfire. The human extremists wanted to silence her to protect their coup. The Cinder Choir loyalists wanted to slaughter her in retaliation for a betrayal she did not commit. The fragile peace was disintegrating by the second, and out in the deep black, a nightmare older than the stars was rapidly closing the distance. Tamsin drew her sidearm, grabbing Vea by the shoulder. The mission of rebuilding a shattered world had just violently mutated. It was now a desperate, bloody race to prevent a manufactured apocalypse. The stolen stealth frigate slipped through the chaotic, blinding crossfire in the upper atmosphere of the capital world. Aboard the cramped vessel, Tamsin Vale gripped the navigational console. Beside her stood Vea Sar, the civilian architect, and Vael Tyr, the defector commander. They had left the fractured peace treaty behind to chase a ghost to the absolute edge of the charted universe. Their destination was the Outer Pale Archive, an ancient, monolithic data vault tethered to a dying brown dwarf star. They had to reach it before the human extremists of the Black Ledger Block completely disengaged the cosmic barrier known as the Resonance Lock. The archive was not a building. It was a hollowed-out moon, encased in rings of frost and dead satellites. As the frigate docked in the silent, lightless cavern of the primary hangar, the sheer scale of the isolation pressed down on them. This was the final boundary. Beyond the reinforced walls of the vault lay the intergalactic void, an endless expanse of absolute nothingness. Tamsin and her small coalition team breached the primary containment doors. The interior was a staggering library of physical, crystalline memory drives stretching into the dark. Vea and Vael Tyr moved immediately to the central terminal, plunging their hands into the deep interface. They bypassed the modern encryptions of their own Supreme Council and dug down to the bedrock of their civilization's history. As the translation matrix decoded the primordial files, the holographic projector bathed the room in a pale, haunting glow. The truth of the galaxy was finally laid bare. The Cinder Choir were never designed to be an Imperial execution squad. They were not born as conquerors or judges. Millions of years ago, they had been created as a localized watchguard. The records showed the horrifying demise of 3 distinct, hyper-advanced ancient civilizations. They had not died of plague, famine, or civil war. They had been entirely consumed by an extragalactic predatory intelligence, designated in the ancient texts as Pale Vector. Tamsin read the scrolling data, her breath catching in her throat. Pale Vector did not hunt biological mass. It did not want water, minerals, or habitable land. It was a macro-intelligence that fed purely on structural geometry and hyperspace resonance. It used the ordered frequencies of faster-than-light travel, massive centralized communication grids, and perfect societal synchronization as a lighthouse beacon. It navigated the lightless void between galaxies by homing in on the acoustic signature of absolute order. The more perfect and structured a civilization became, the brighter it burned to the predator. The original, sacred mandate of the Cinder Choir had been to enforce a strict limit on localized resonance. They were meant to keep the galaxy dark and quiet, pruning away dangerous technologies before they could ring the bell. But over thousands of generations, that terrifying duty had slowly calcified into a bureaucratic nightmare. The Supreme Council of the Choir realized that maintaining the fear of the dark gave them absolute, unquestioned authority over their own people. To maintain their iron grip, the mission was corrupted. The Council began executing innocent species not because they were actually too loud, but simply to eliminate potential political rivals, hoard resources, or maintain the grand illusion of their own holy necessity. They had taken a very real, apocalyptic cosmic horror and used it as a convenient rug to sweep their own manufactured atrocities under. The perfect killers were just corrupt politicians hiding behind a monster. Before Tamsin could fully process the weight of the revelation, the heavy vault doors behind them blew open with a deafening kinetic crack. Heavily armed operatives poured into the archive, their weapons raised and locked onto the small coalition team. Walking casually through the smoke was a man in a pristine, human naval uniform. It was Fleet Admiral Corrin, the very officer who had sponsored Tamsin for command at the Naval Academy. He was the architect of the Black Ledger block. "You are incredibly persistent, Tamsin," Corrin said, his voice echoing in the cavernous data vault. He held a small, violently pulsing cryptographic drive in his hand, the master key to the resonance lock. "You are going to summon it," Tamsin said, stepping in front of the terminal. "You hijacked the planetary grid to get its attention, and now you are going to open the front door." Why? Corrin did not look insane. He looked terrifyingly calm. "Because the Galactic Assembly is a pathetic, squabbling mess of cowards. The moment they feel safe, they will turn their massive economies and armadas against humanity. They fear us. The only way to ensure the survival of our species is to hold the leash. But the galaxy will never willingly hand us absolute authority." He gestured toward the massive blast shields covering the observation windows. "They need a reason to submit. When Pale Vector manifests at the border, when they see the true face of annihilation staring at them from the dark, the Assembly will panic. They will shatter. And in that moment of absolute terror, we will offer them the only protection left. They will gladly embrace a human military dictatorship if it means surviving the night." True. Lasting order can only be built on a foundation of absolute fear. Tamsin looked at her former mentor. He was willing to let a primordial nightmare burn half the galaxy just to rule the ashes. She was trapped at the edge of the universe with a handful of loyalists, a battered stealth ship, and no reinforcements. She faced a catastrophic binary choice. She could try to kill Corrin, steal the key, and bury the truth again. It would keep Pale Vector at bay, but the galaxy would remain fractured. The Cinder Choir hardliners would restart the war out of vengeance, and the cycle of secretive slaughter would continue forever. The alternative was to expose everything. Doing so would cause a galactic panic so profound it might tear their political infrastructure apart before the monster even arrived. Tamsin Vale looked at Veyasar, the architect, who had learned to defy her own perfect programming, and Vile Tyr, the soldier who had chosen anomaly over doctrine. She made the choice that almost no one in the long, bloody history of the universe was ever brave enough to make. Fear does not build order, Tamsin said coldly. It just builds better cages. Without looking away from Corin, Tamsin slammed her hand down on the archive's primary uplink terminal. She did not target Corin with a weapon. She targeted the vast, decentralized human ragline network floating in the deep black. She bypassed every diplomatic filter, every military firewall, and every classified restriction in existence. She dumped the entire unbroken truth into the public domain. The original tragic mandate of the choir, the horrific corruption of the Supreme Council, the engineered treason of the Black Ledger Block, and the terrifying mathematical reality of Pale Vector. She broadcast it unencrypted to every terminal, every warship, and every civilian datapad across 1 billion star systems. Corin roared in fury, raising his weapon as a brutal firefight erupted inside the vault. But he was too late. The upload had completed. The sheer amount of raw, localized energy required to broadcast the unredacted truth across the entire galactic disk had a terrifying, immediate consequence. It acted as the final, blinding flash of the lighthouse. The combat inside the vault abruptly halted as the cosmic background radiation meters on their hazard suits plummeted to absolute zero. The heavy blast shields covering the archive's observation windows automatically retracted, sensing a massive gravitational anomaly. Outside, the starless void of the outer pale was no longer empty. The fabric of reality itself was physically fracturing, a colossal tear in space-time, bleeding a cold, structural, and terrifyingly geometric light, slowly ripped open. The truth was out. The alarm had been rung. Pale Vector had found the door, and there was absolutely no way to turn back. Pale Vector bled into local space not as an invading armada of metal and fire, but as a sprawling, macro-structural nervous system composed of freezing, geometric light. It was an apex predator, born of pure physics. It did not use thermal sensors or radar to find its prey. It hunted by locking onto the stability of hyperspace resonance. The more mathematically perfect and orderly a star system was, the deeper Pale Vector sank its luminous, jagged claws into the fabric of reality. As the colossal intergalactic tear widened, illuminating the dark edge of the universe, the human extremists of the Black Ledger Block made their final, catastrophic move. Admiral Corin broadcast a system-wide override, effectively launching a violent coup against Earth Command and the fragile Allied fleet. His strategy was absolute, merciless cauterization. He intended to seize the primary command nodes and overload the localized resonance grid, turning the entire border region into a hyperspace firestorm. It would vaporize Pale Vector, but it would also incinerate billions of civilian lives across 36 inhabited planetary systems. To Corin and his loyalists, trading billions of lives to save trillions was simply necessary math. Tamsin Vale categorically rejected the math. It was the fastest way to end the threat. But she understood a fundamental truth that the Admiralty willfully ignored. If humanity saved the galaxy by utilizing the exact same doctrine of mass execution that the Cinder Choir had used for millennia, they were just changing the name of the tyrant. They would become the new monsters of the cosmos. She opened a direct, unencrypted tactical link to the scattered remnants of the human naval fleet, the civilian ragline operators, and the defecting Cinder Choir armadas. Her counter-proposal sounded like absolute tactical lunacy. They would not fight Pale Vector with kinetic force or suicidal planetary firestorms. They would fight it with an overwhelming sensory paradox. Tamsin called it the grand countersong. They needed to blend the chaotic, unpredictable adaptability of human engineering with the flawless, synchronized amplification of the Cinder choir, and layer it all over the forgotten, archaic resonance codes of the ancient species the choir had wrongly erased. While the Allied vanguard threw their heavily armored dreadnoughts into the freezing light to buy precious minutes, Tamsin led a desperate boarding action. Her stolen stealth frigate slammed violently into the armored hull of Admiral Corrin's hijacked flagship. She fought her way through the pristine corridors, her kinetic rifle running hot as she bypassed the Loyalist barricades. When she finally kicked down the heavy blast doors of the bridge, Corrin was standing at the primary firing console, his hand hovering over the authorization lock for the border-wide firestorm. "You are weak, Tamsin," Corrin spat, drawing his sidearm, his eyes wide with fanatical desperation. "Fear is the only tool that will ever unite this fractured galaxy. If we do not burn this border, if we do not show them that we are willing to do the unthinkable, everything dies." Tamsin did not flinch. She kept her weapon lowered, walking slowly toward her former mentor. "Fear just isolates us." "Corrin," she replied, her voice steady and cold. "It makes us predictable." "It makes us easy to pick off. Millions of kilometers away, on the command deck of a defecting dreadnought, Vea Sar did something that had never occurred in the millions of years of her civilization's rigid history. The civilian architect opened a wideband telepathic link to every single Cinder Choir warrior in the sector. She did not command them to synchronize. She begged them to break. She asked the perfect executioners to intentionally sing out of tune. She ordered them to abandon the immaculate rhythm of their ancestors, to shatter their own holy dogma, and embrace the terrifying anomaly of human variance. It was an agonizing psychological leap for a species bred entirely for absolute perfection. But one by one, the void black warriors closed their eyes and let their minds slip into the chaotic, disjointed rhythm of the human broadcast. The network ignited across the dark. It was not just warships transmitting the signal. It was civilian orbital stations, deep space mining rigs, automated weather satellites, rusty cargo haulers, and discarded logistics hubs. Every single piece of machinery capable of transmitting a frequency was linked together in a sprawling, jury-rigged web spanning millions of miles. The massive countersong hit Pale Vector like a physical wall of solid iron. The extragalactic entity was an apex predator designed to hunt clean, predictable, beautiful models of order. It suddenly found itself choking on a resonance grid that was a spectacular contradiction. The signal was simultaneously precise and incredibly messy, intensely disciplined yet violently rebellious. The human chaos broke the predator's sensory grip, while the choir's raw telepathic power pushed the entity backward. The ancient archive codes of the dead species acted as a jagged, indigestible barrier. It was a defense mechanism that only a true, willing alliance between humanity and the executioners could ever create. Unable to lock onto a definitive target, starving in the face of absolute, unified dissonance, the nervous system of cold light began to wither. Pale Vector shrieked in a structural frequency that shattered glass and buckled steel across a dozen planets. Then, slowly, the colossal tear in space-time collapsed in on itself. The rift was permanently sealed. On the bridge of the flagship, Corrin's loyalist crew lowered their weapons and surrendered the moment the cosmic threat vanished from the sensors. The extremist coup dissolved instantly, its foundation of terror completely undermined by the triumph of unity. The aftermath of the battle fundamentally rewrote the architecture of the cosmos. The galactic death sentence program was permanently dismantled. The Supreme Council of the Cinder Choir was overthrown, their absolute, terrifying authority stripped away by their own awakened people. The executioners laid down their dark mandate. They were systematically reorganized and reborn as a transparent, multi-species guardian force. Their perfect logistical networks finally utilized to protect the fragile diversity of the universe instead of burning it to ash. Many months later, Tamsin Vale stood on the scorched soil of the Nysa Verge agricultural belt, right where the nightmare had first ripped the sky open. The heavy atmospheric smoke had finally cleared. For the first time in years, the horizon did not burn with the terrifying silver light of war or the cold, violet engines of the executioners. It glowed with the warm, golden hues of a quiet, uninterrupted dawn. She breathed in the cool morning air, finally understanding the profound irony of the journey. Humanity had indeed started a war with the ultimate killers of the galaxy. But they had not won the war by proving they were better at killing, or by becoming a darker terror. They had ended the conflict by forcing a terrified, isolated galaxy to finally learn how to live together, proving once and for all that survival was not about erasing the unknown, but finding the courage to stand side by side in the chaotic dark. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please drop a comment below, letting us know where in the world you are listening from, so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Sci-Fi Stories channel, like the video, and support us even more by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.